Brian Fairchild, a former CIA case officer with nearly 2 decades of experience, operated in the shadows under official and non-official cover across Asia, Southeast Asia, Europe, the Arabian Peninsula, and Afghanistan. As a recognized expert in intelligence, Brian has testified before Congress as well as imparted his counterterrorism expertise to over 10,000 professionals in the FBI, CIA, military personnel, and police officers. Brian is now channeling his knowledge and expertise into the field of literature and has written a new pulse-pounding thriller entitled The Hidden. But before we get to that, the novel, The Hidden, thank you, Brian, for coming on.
Daniel, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's great meeting you.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been seeing you around and on some of the other kind of podcasts and very, very fascinating stuff. You're a very gripping subject to kind of, pick the brain of Brian Fairchild just to see what you know
I'm flattered. Thank you.
Yeah, well, let's start just for my audience. Like, how does one get into the CIA?
All right. Do you want to actually hear this whole personal story?
Yeah, the true ugly
Yeah, the
story,
true ugly story.
lurid.
Well, to tell you the truth, and the reason why I like telling this part of the story is because, kids need to know that inspiration is important and that you can be inspired by, a lot of many different things, but reading is really important. So when I was about, I don't know, 13 years old, I was living in Mesa, Arizona. Mesa, Arizona is hot, 110 degrees in the shade, that sort of thing. And I read the book, Jack London's Call of the Wild. And Jack London's Call of the Wild is about this kid up in Alaska, and he's got a sled dog, and it's all their adventures and all this sort of thing. Now, for a kid down in the desert, looking at saguaro cactuses and cacti, sorry, looking at saguaro cacti and imagining what it must be like up in Alaska with pine trees and snow, and I mean, it just carried my imagination away. So from that point on, I had already had this mindset that I got to go out there. I got to do something out there. Adventure is calling. When I got to, then I moved to Boulder, Colorado. And in Boulder, Colorado, swear to God, I mean, of all the places to get inspiration, I went to the movie theater, and I saw Sean Connery in From Russia with Love. That was their first 007 James Bond movie. And I'm telling you, Daniel, I mean, I got hooked right there. I mean, everything about the movie captured my imagination. I mean, it was filmed in Istanbul. There were foreign languages were being spoken. Great scenery. There's great girls too, and Bond got the girl, and then Bond would do cool things like he would go in his hotel room and check for listening devices and all that kind of stuff. And I, as a 14-year-old kid, I'm just eating this up with a big spoon. So, right there, I decided that's what I want to do right there. So I get really curious, and I'm just kind of a curious guy when I want to know about something. I can't wait, for weeks to find out about it. I got to find out about it right now. So I left the movie theater, went down to the Boulder, public library, because this was way before computers and iPhones and all that. And I started searching and asking the librarian for help to search on everything I could find out about CIA. And man, I mean, there was nothing that was written for 14-year-old wannabe spies. I mean, everything was an adult, report about CIA. So
So,
I
so
started reading
basically, I'm going
those.
to jump in just really quickly and interrupt you.
Yeah.
So basically, when you started asking about the CIA, is this when the CIA kind of fixed on your location as a child and kind of threw you
Yeah.
into a white van?
Yeah, it's almost, but I even gave him an easier time than that, as I'll tell you here in just a second. So I'm looking at all this stuff, and the librarian's like, "Oh, what a sweet young man," and all this sort of thing. And I'm reading Ross and Wise, CIA, and I'm trying to find James Bond in the pages somewhere, and I couldn't find him anywhere. And so I got really frustrated, and I'm like, "Man, there's got to be a way." So I decided I'll write to CIA. So I was taking a typing class in Centennial Junior High School in Boulder, Colorado. We had a format book. Now I didn't type the letter to CIA at school because I didn't want anybody to know what I was writing, because I felt kind of silly writing it to begin with. But I used a pencil. I wrote on lined notebook paper in block letters and capital block letters, and I said something to the effect, Daniel, "Dear CIA, I would like to be a spy. Can you tell me about how to do that?" yours sincerely, Brian Fairchild. And I got a stamp from my mom, put it on the envelope, and I mailed it. After a week or so, I'd basically forgotten about it, but it was important. I mean, I'd scratched the itch, that sort of thing. One day I came home from school, and there, propped up on the pillow, my mom had gotten this letter and propped it up on my pillow, and I come in the room, and there's this letter, and it's got, it's a U.S. government envelope, and it's in color, and it says Central Intelligence Agency, and I'm like, oh man, and it's addressed to Mr. Fairchild. And as soon as I saw that, I'm like, oh my God, I'm in real trouble. I mean, what they're doing is they're writing to my dad, and they're going to say, Mr. Fairchild, keep your son restrained. I mean, we're an important agency, and we can't have, block letters and pencil and stuff written to us. Well, take your son, aside and tell him that, just leave it alone. But as I opened the letter, I found a 2-page typed letter, and I start reading it, and it said, dear Mr. Fairchild, it's a pleasure to find out that young Americans like yourself want to, work with the U.S. government and Central Intelligence Agency in particular. They were writing to me. Now, as a 14-year-old kid, getting a letter on, CIA colored letterhead and addressed to me and talking to me as an adult, my self-esteem just shot through the roof. I mean, I couldn't believe it. And the most important thing, Daniel, about this letter, well, two things that are interesting. One, it was written by a case officer by the name of Michael Todorovich. Now, if you remember, I just saw From Russia with Love. So they're KGB guys and Russians and all these foreign names and stuff. And I'm getting a letter from CIA Mikhail Todorovich. So right there, I'm like,
Yeah.
whoa, what a great name. Whoa, Todorovich.
Yeah.
And then he doesn't send me a form letter. He sends me a real letter. I mean, he gives me a plan, what I subsequently called for the rest of my life, the Todorovich plan. And he says, I mean, when you think back on it, it's kind of silly, but he says, great, Brian, thanks for the interest. Here's some advice I have for you. Stay in junior high school. That's important. Go on to high school and do your best, and try to learn as much as you can. And if it seems right and you go to college, well, I would suggest you take international relations or international politics or area studies or something like that. And a language is very important. Here in CIA, we deal with foreign cultures all the time. So you need a foreign language, and military is a big deal too. So if you've got a chance and you can go to the military, before you apply to us, that'd be great. And then 6 months prior to you ready being to accept employment with us, contact us, and we'll do your interviews and your polygraph, and we'll bring you on board. I mean, I figured I had it made. I mean, it's like I just got an offer from CIA when I was 14 years old right here. So what I basically did is I followed that plan. I mean, obviously I didn't follow it every single day, and there were times in my life that things went up and things went down. Wasn't sure I was ever going to get out of high school at one point. Never sure I was going to get into college at another point. But when I did, and I got into all those things, I did exactly what Michael Todorovich, told me to do. And one of the things I did was I joined the 19th Special Forces Group. I became a Green Beret, and this is my hat that's commemorating, my group, the 19th group right here. And so I got into Special Forces, went off to Fort Bragg, got trained, did all that, then came back. And 19th Special Forces Group is a U.S. National Guard group. So I was home, I did a year over, a year, not overseas, a year for training. I had to go through airborne school and Special Forces qualification and all that sort of thing. Then I came back to my unit. And after a few years, I decided I was going to go to China, because now I was more mature than most people my age. And it's like, hey, I could do that. I can go to college. So I finally went to college. I went to college at Cal State at Chico, and I graduated with the exact degrees that old Michael Todorovich suggested. I graduated with a dual major, international relations and Asian studies, with Chinese, because I was an exchange student in my junior year. So I went to Taiwan for a year and got a fluency in Mandarin Chinese.
Wow.
And so when I applied to the agency as a 25-year-old kid, I had done everything Michael Todorovich had said I should do. And they said, great, want a job? Good deal. And they made me, I took the oath, and I became a clandestine service officer for CIA. And then I
That is
worked
amazing.
basically two decades after that.
That just shows like how focused you were. I mean, even though you said there's, times there's ups, there's downs, but essentially you knew what, like in ethics, they call that a telos, right? Like the Greek word for the purpose of something. The telos of a
Yeah.
toaster is to brown your bread. The telos of a refrigerator is to keep your food cold. People have teloses too. Some want to be a
Yeah.
doctor. That's what they're born to be. Some want to be a
Right.
musician.
Right.
But the fact that you knew your telos as a 14-year-old and you
Yeah.
stayed to it, that actually speaks a lot to your credit and why they would have scooped you up. So it doesn't make it's not surprising to me that they saw somebody who stayed basically focused. You'd
Right.
want someone like that, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. I was a little bit neurotic like that. So like, let's grab this guy. He's perfect for us.
Well, one of the things I'm a huge Jack London fan, by the way. I've read
Uh-huh.
almost all his works that I'm aware of.
Great. Great.
Yeah, he's famous. Like all these things that he's credited, that people credit to other people, like the road books. They might credit those to like the beat writers and stuff like that. Jack
Right.
Kerouac. That
Yeah.
was actually Jack London invented that genre. He also invented the genre of the boxing story that we associate with Hemingway. He also
Yeah.
invented the dystopian novel. In 1914, he had a book called The Iron Heel, and it was essentially, like a totalitarian state takes over. So it's funny. And
Right.
by the way, that's one of my favorite novels too, Call of the Wild.
Yeah.
The Nietzschean underpinnings of that, like how you get back to your kind of savage roots and stuff like that. And it's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
metaphor, but wonderful stuff. It's interesting that
Oh
it was
yeah.
that
Oh, yeah.
inspired you.
It just all came together. I when I started reading, Call of the Wild, I was in my bedroom for hours at a time. I probably read it, the whole thing in a day and a half or something like that as a 13-year-old.
Mhm.
So I was really hooked. And I looked out at the desert and I'm like, man, I can't be here my whole life. And
The
and
Klondike.
yeah, I'm going there. It immediately just captured my whole attention, and then the whole thing came together,
Mhm.
right? So with that, with London, and then James Bond, and
Mhm.
seeing it visually, because there wasn't a movie out yet on Call of the Wild.
Yeah.
So seeing it visually, and then it just all came together. And then when I got that letter, yeah, I'll tell you, for a while I slept with that letter under my pillow. That
And a
was how
gun.
it was to me. But there's also a sad part of that story because,
Mhm.
when we're aspirational, when we're looking to do something, all those things are really important, right? I got a letter from CIA. I got this. I've got my green beret, and that sort of thing. But then once you do it, once I got into the agency,
Mhm.
then that letter became less important, and I misplaced it somewhere, and I can't
Oh.
to this day I can't find it. And my brother says, "Hey, you ever find that letter?" Because the whole family knew about it.
Mhm.
I said, "Well, maybe it's a mom and dad stuff, And he said, "Well, I've gone through most of the stuff when we put it in in storage, and I don't remember ever seeing it." And I said, "Yeah, but it's just a letter. It could be, in between something." But
Mhm.
I lost the letter somehow, and now I realize as an adult how important that sort of thing is,
Mhm.
and why I should have brought it with me and stored it, safely, and so I could have it now and later, later years. But I'm sorry
You
to say I didn't do that, and I don't
There's a
have.
joke there, like Mission Impossible, right? Where the letter would disappear, right? You could just
Yeah,
like
maybe
use that
that's
as
it.
yeah, it
Maybe
blew
that's what
up,
it was.
smoke started coming. Yeah, but
One day I looked under my pillow, it wasn't there anymore.
one of the things too, which is funny too to your life, like if someone were to write a biography of you, it is interesting, and that there's a circular kind of like a completion of your life starts before the CIA. It starts with literature. Then you
Yeah,
go into the CIA inspired by literature. Then you go full circle and you kind of
yeah,
complete
yeah.
that circle writing, your great books
Writing
that are
books.
informed by all this. And I wanted to hit something as well, just to point out to
Sure.
you as well that or just to get your take on this. So you were inspired not just by the novel, but also by movies, by popular culture. And
Right.
I remember when Top Gun came out, circa
Yeah.
1986, and it increased, all these, people enlisting in the Air Force
Sure.
by
Sure.
like 10,000%. And so the same thing happened with the Bond movies. I mean, you look like
Right.
Ian Fleming was in intelligence, right? And
Absolutely.
yeah, and so they had to
Absolutely.
basically change the public perception of spies, because if you read in the 19th century, Balzac has this novel, I think it's called Pere Goriot, and there's a spy, a government spy in the 19th century in France, and when he moves into the boarding house with the rest of the people threaten the landlady, saying, "We're going to move out because you have this
Mm.
spy here," and
Uh-huh.
spies were
Yeah.
very looked down upon, and so they had to glamorize spies. So they're like, Ian Fleming, come glam. So you
Yeah.
kind of like Top Gun, you
Yeah.
saw this
Absolutely.
propaganda
Yeah, and Ian Fleming. I was so the same thing with Ian Fleming. You make the same observation. He started. I forget what Ian Fleming's childhood was like, but certainly he was in MI6, which was James Bond's
Mhm.
James Bond service and military and intelligence six MI6, and and he eventually wrote the whole series of books. So he went through that same circle too, which is kind of interesting. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
I thought
like
that'd
you
be
guys
cool.
are closet literary guys, and you
Yeah,
started as closet literary, and it's funny
yeah.
too. Arnold Bennett, H.G. Wells, they start
Mhm.
like in the very first Ministry of Propaganda, was in like 1916 in England, World War One, and it was all the writers. Arnold Bennett
Yeah,
was a best-selling author. He got H.G. Wells, a best-selling author. They got a bunch of their friends, and they started writing kind of government propaganda. And this brings me to a question too. Yuri Bezmenov did a famous interview with G. Edward Griffin, and he was talking about his time with the KGB. And he said that most of the KGB's work was not, in fact, counterintelligence. He said like 85% of their budget was basically being a ministry of propaganda to kind of manipulate their own populace. So
yeah,
they owned
yeah.
all of these, obviously Pravda and all these media outlets. And so the
Sure.
same thing happened. He said the CIA was very similar. And in the church commissions that came out, like in the 70s, that the CIA owned all these magazines, like, Ms. Magazine and Now, and all these TV stations and all these, kind of publications. So what's your take on that?
Well,
The
though the interesting
literary
thing is,
origins.
we had that kind of a program, but the interesting thing to that is that we were trying to counter the Soviets. We were trying to counter the KGB. All they were doing. You were, hey man, we better do something like that too. But we had really restraints on us. I mean, you couldn't like when you're recruiting spies, you couldn't recruit a member of the clergy, you couldn't recruit a journalist because the thing was, or the thing still is, in the United States, we have privacy laws and we have, all these laws we have to pass that the KGB and the Chinese and the North Koreans don't have to. And so the idea was if I recruited some kind of a journalist and put press placements, propaganda for our side in the paper, and it got to American citizens, it wasn't just overseas, and all of a sudden the CIA is trying to change American values and views, and we weren't allowed to do that. So they said, no, you can't do any of that. But if we can get limited press placements in foreign newspapers to counter something locally, then that was okay. So it was that, but we were actually trying to get back on the Soviets. In fact, the CIA was created to counter the Soviets. That's the whole reason CIA was created.
And that brings me to my next question, because in one of your interviews that I watched, and it was very fascinating, you talked about when the existential crisis that not just the CIA went through, but really the United States went through. And before getting the question, I'm just going to point out Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan in the 1600s. He's
Yeah.
talking about the dangers of a republic. And he says in a monarchy, everybody knows who's in charge, right? It's the king. You look up at the castle, oh, that guy's in charge.
Right.
In a republic where anybody can potentially become leader, there's a lot more jockeying for power, a lot more infighting, internecine fighting. And he says that a republic is only ever at peace with itself when it has an external enemy. He says, if there's no external enemy, they will start fighting themselves, kind of like the US in the Civil War. And so we had this external enemy called the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union disappears in 1991, or, ostensibly, I mean, there are people who have
Yeah.
their, Golitsyn
Right.
theorizes that it was a fake collapse. But anyway, let's just go with the official story. The Soviet Union goes down in 1991, and suddenly the United States loses its telos, just to go back to that, its purpose. All of a sudden, we stop being, the country. We identified ourselves, we just differentiated ourselves from the communists by saying, oh, we're not godless atheists. In God we trust, one
Right.
nation under God, and then all of a sudden when the Soviet Union goes, that just goes out the window. We start falling apart as a society. There's this civilizational crisis. And you said the CIA had a very similar thing. They called it the peace
Yeah.
dividend. They started shutting down foreign bureaus. And this is the question I wanted to get to. It reminded me very much of you looked at the crisis in news, the vacuum, as journalists were complaining about this, that when you had corporate consolidation, they started shutting down foreign bureaus. And when they started shutting down foreign bureaus, they didn't know what was going on. All of a sudden they're just getting propaganda from the State Department or propaganda from, whatever official channel it is. And nobody could fact check it. There was nobody on the ground in these foreign countries. They just had to take people's words. The reporting went down the tubes. And you made a very similar point. You said when they started shutting down field offices, suddenly the CIA lost its mojo. They stopped knowing what was going on internationally and started having their lunch eaten by a lot of, kind of China, Russia, et cetera.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's absolutely I mean, so when 1991 came around, like I say, we were set up to counter the Soviet Union. That was the whole reason CIA was set up. I mean, there had been the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, during World War II, but after the war, see, it's kind of strange how the United States works. So after the war, I mean, the OSS was a very effective organization, and a lot of the people that went from OSS to CIA. But in 1945, everybody closed down OSS. It's like, hey, you guys did a great job, man. Way to go. We don't need you anymore. And get rid of them because now the army wants to do other things, right? I mean, there's no more war. We can do other things now. And and the same thing happened with CIA. I mean, CIA was there fighting the Cold War the whole time, and then all of a sudden, when the Berlin Wall goes down in 1991, Soviet Union, becomes just Russia, and all the federated states, move away. Well, the whole reason, the raison d'etre for CIA to exist was gone. And not only was it gone, but there was nobody in government apparently that had the foresight to say, well, the reason we said we created the CIA was okay to go after the Soviets, but to prevent things like Pearl Harbor from ever happening again. So you would think that you would want to have a level of special foreign intelligence at some level for the whole duration of the republic, right? I mean, you're looking out for threats, but that's not what the politicians and the policymakers did. They said, in fact, Daniel, you probably remember, I mentioned Daniel Patrick Moynihan. At the time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was one of the famous congressmen in all of Congress, and he came up to Jim Woolsey, who's on this picture here. He came up to Jim Woolsey and said, "Hey, Jim, way to go! You guys you beat them in the Cold War, and the Soviet Union is no longer. And do we even need a CIA anymore? Do we need you guys? I mean, what do we need you guys for?" They actually believed that there was an end to history, that the Soviet Union was dead. Now the United States was going to be the only power anybody had to deal with, and so we don't need this stuff anymore. And there's a lot of money that goes into intelligence. I mean, the intelligence institutions are huge. I mean, there's a huge budget, not just CIA, but the Defense Department, Defense Intelligence Agency, all the military intelligence services, NSA, GSA. I mean, all these organizations. And so they wanted to stop funding all of that and get the peace dividend and spend that in their own constituencies, because that's what people do, right? It's like, we don't need you anymore. I could sure use the money, so let's give me the money. So poor CIA for 10 years, after 1991, for 10 years, it had no mission. It had no primary mission. And they had no mentorship or leadership in policymaking, or the presidents who felt the same way, right? So Jim Woolsey, he used to joke about the fact that he was there under Clinton, and he said, he only got in to see Clinton like twice in his whole tenure. And if you remember, there was a time when a light aircraft crashed into the White House lawn. And Jim Woolsey used to say, "Yeah, it was me trying to get in to see the president because nobody wanted to see him." His CIA director, nobody wanted to see the CIA director because
Interesting.
what is he going to tell me about? We already defeated the Soviet Union. We don't need those guys anymore. So poor CIA, like a rudderless ship, is just doing a few things on counterterrorism and doing a few things over here for a decade, and they started shutting down bases and stations, and the farm, our place where we go to get trained, fell into disrepair, and the number of people that were applying to the agency dramatically dropped, and that continued until September 9th, September 11th, 2001, 10 years later, when all of a sudden Al Qaeda attacked. And now CIA had its new mission. But it wasn't, and here's why I blame CIA here and the policymakers and so forth at the same time, because nobody was watching CIA. Nobody was saying, okay, we do need you guys, and here's your priorities. They just let it go, right? So when CIA and George Tenet, who was director at the time, figured, oh, okay, we've got our new mission, they focused like a laser, man. They focused on like laser on counterterrorism. But not one of many, not one, more, an equal number of primary missions. It was the only primary mission, the only mission really. And so from that time on, for 20 years after, it was nothing but counterterrorism. And Daniel, from all of your reading and your experience, I mean, when an institution focuses like a laser so hard on one thing, that's what it becomes. It can't be anything else because that's all that it's focusing on. So when you're looking at an institution, you're talking about, well, we need a budget. Well, what's the budget? The budget is for counterterrorism, counterterrorism tools, counterterrorism cyber, counterterrorism everything. And we need to recruit a different kind of person now. No more Brian Fairchild with the envelope underneath his pillow. We need to get operators, special operators that can operate in a paramilitary sense against these terrorists. Mm-hmm. And so they didn't even go out and create their own cool special operations. We have special activities division, a special operations group. But those guys, there are very few guys like me in there. There were a few, but what they did is they went to the teams. They went to SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force and the SEAL teams and the 75th Ranger Regiment and Marine Recon. And they recruited guys right out of those teams and said, how would you like to work for CIA? And, a lot of these guys were getting ready to either re-up or get out, and they, got an offer from CIA. So they just went right over, into special activities division and became our paramilitary case officers, who then started going to Afghanistan and so forth and so on. So, but the rest, and let me just interject one thing here too. I've got to make this clear to your listeners that in spy work, in espionage, where there's different facets. A paramilitary counterterrorism officer is not like the James Bond espionage officer, right? They're two separately different things. In the James Bond kind of a model, of course, James Bond was fiction and he wasn't, a real guy or anything. But in that side of the house, what you were looking for were case officers who would go and live overseas their whole career, make relationships with people who well, maybe on their first tour, they make a relationship with a young guy who eventually becomes the prime minister, but you were there, you've got that relationship. America's got that relationship. And so your purpose in that side, the espionage side, is to create networks and recruit spies in foreign governments, by establishing relationships and getting to know people. And then when it's time to recruit them, you say, well, hey, Bob, a baby needs a new pair of shoes. Your wife needs that operation. Maybe I can help. I got some friends who maybe they can help. And your expertise would really be appreciated. And it's that kind of thing. But the paramilitary counterterrorism guys are just like you see in the movies, and then you got your weapons and you got your goggles, and you're going after the bad guy, and you're going after that one bad guy or that one cell. Boom, 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 boom. That's it. We go home. Now we wait for the next mission. Now let's do that again. So there's a whole difference between, what I'm basically going to be talking about here all during this interview, and the paramilitary guys. The paramilitary guys, CIA's got one of the best paramilitary outfits in the world, because they got all the guys from the best teams in the world, working for CIA. But now terrorism has become sort of, passe, right? And redundant for the agency, because you still have the teams. And those teams don't need the special authorities anymore. The CIA is a civilian organization brought to the table. So then CIA found itself all of a sudden with the world again as its target, and no experienced case officers, because it was all counterterrorism. So does that make sense to you? As I explained it, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. One of the things too that you made me think about as well was what happens when initially the enemy was external, right? And then, so you have this defensive posture of protecting your people. When it changes from the Soviet Union to counterterrorism, suddenly the people become the enemy. The people are potential cells. The people, and we start patting down the people at TSA. Everybody is treated. Schools look like prisons, are built, in fact, by the same contractors that make prisons. There's metal detectors and X-rays and, every background checks, everything. And so all of a sudden we're living in an open air concentration camp. And now what happens when the people become the enemy? rather than the Soviets being the enemy, is this very like this dark shift into possible quasi totalitarianism. There's
Yeah,
a
but
book called Political
oh, go ahead.
Ponerology that's all about that, the rise of totalitarianism, and so that's one of the dangers that I see in that.
Yeah, but I mean, all I can do is tell you from my point of view, and I didn't put it and I didn't see it in that context. What happens in an institution like CIA is when all of a sudden they found, I mean, they were riding high during the 20 years of counterterrorism. I mean, they were everywhere, right? And they had all these guys going on all these missions, and we got Bin Laden and all of that sort of thing. I mean, they were doing good work, and the whole country thought that's what they needed to do because we got hit on 9/11. So man, this is what we got to do. And when your leaders tell you we got this stuff covered, that's great. So the population was for them. Yeah, everybody was for them. They were doing great work, but they were letting China and Russia and North Korea and Iran develop in ways that we should never have allowed because we
Yep.
didn't have that other side of the house. We didn't have Brian Fairchild and his guys out there penetrating governments and coming up and telling, the president and National Security Council, hey, boss, we got a problem here. What do you mean, Fairchild? What do you mean? Well, this whole China thing. I mean, China's really, I mean, they're really getting powerful. Yeah, yeah. Well, tell us about it later when something really happens. I mean, if you don't have those guys coming and saying, hey, boss, you know, that China just took over the South China Sea, boss.
Mm-hmm.
That's a problem. No, not Fairchild. Okay, we're still we're going after Bin Laden. I mean, it's coming up. Yeah, but boss, now China and Russia, they seem to be like getting together in an alliance. I mean, against us. I mean,
Yeah.
if you don't have those guys, you don't have. If you're a policymaker, you don't have to worry about it.
Well,
If it's not there, you don't have to worry about it, right? But if all of a sudden
yeah.
somebody rubs your nose in it, then you have to acknowledge it, and that's where the institution failed.
Mm-hmm.
Is that I mean, they still had a few China things going. Don't let me make you think that it just went boom. We don't have anything but counterterrorism because they're an institution. They need a budget, and if they can, pad the budget a little bit by saying, well, we need X number of million for our China operations and X number of million for our Middle Eastern operation, they still get more money. But the whole focus of the agency was on nothing but counterterrorism, and the counterterrorism center, the CIA then started building centers. When I was in, we didn't have centers. We had a directorate of operations and a directorate of intelligence. And within the directorate of operations, which was the spies, all the spies, not paramilitary guys, but all the spies, like I've just been describing, that's how it existed. But then, CIA started, coming back into espionage and stuff. So they started creating centers, like the Center for East Asia and the Pacific and the Center for Counterterrorism. Well, the Center for Counterterrorism, because of everything that we've just talked about, how focused CIA was on only counterterrorism, became the locus of power in CIA. So, before maybe if you had the East Asia division and all of Asia, take care of, during the old Cold War, that was a real powerhouse itself. And Soviet Eastern European division. I mean, everybody went to them because we were working against the Soviets. But now they go to the Counterterrorism Center. So even now, when they need to do things against China, the deputy director of CIA doesn't go to the East Asia Pacific, center or East Asia, division or any. He goes to the Counterterrorism Center and has to talk those guys into, look, we really have to give up money and resources to do this China thing, guys, because they are the locus of power. And that's how it got all, cattywaller, all messed up.
What I was referring to was, I mean, and this isn't necessarily the CIA per se, I mean, but it's just, kind of our government, just in a general sense, General Milley, the biggest, threat is white males. You look at the FBI and they say, oh, the white supremacy is the biggest thing, and people who like the Constitution, people who are religious, people who like classical literature, these are your domestic terrorists. And so what it looks like is there's a supply and demand problem where they get funding based on supply of terrorists, and if there is no supply, then they'll create this fake demand, and suddenly they're telling you granny down the street who goes to the traditional Latin mass is a potential domestic terrorist. And so as the people become the enemy, then they start getting really lazy about foreign threats, because now if you even mention a foreign threat, oh, did you say China? Bigot. what that's that white supremacy rearing its ugly
Yeah,
head. And of course China's, and meanwhile China is quietly, just recently in the news, China has just acquired all these ports all around the world in the global
yeah,
supply chain. It's quietly building its network, its power, because our intelligence agencies have been focused on granny at the traditional Latin mass.
yeah. Well, yeah, and so and that's the whole point. China didn't all of a sudden occur just yesterday, right? I mean, China has been building its power and getting those ports and developing its hypersonic missiles for decades and decades, right? And but you didn't have that side of the house going and saying, "Hey, boss, we have a problem." Right. So if the policymaker doesn't know about it, or isn't forced to know about it, he doesn't have to deal with that, and he can deal with his own, domestic transformational policies for the United States and wokeism and all that kind of stuff. If you've got that side of the house and they're an important side of the house and they're coming and telling you, look at what China's doing, you kind of have to take interest in that, and that's what's happening now. But look at how belatedly it's taking into. I mean, like I say, China for 2 decades, more than 2 decades, has been building that up. A perfect example is what I threw out a minute ago about the South China Sea. In 2014, they started doing the man-made islands in the South China Sea. And I remember, because I research this every single day. I mean, I'm an intelligence officer for life. It doesn't matter if I'm in out. I'm watching this stuff every day. So I'm watching this stuff, and they start building these islands, and I'm like, hey guys, this is a problem. China's building artificial islands in the South China Sea, and you can bet that's not for just beaches and things like that. Nah, nobody paid attention. You know, 4 years later, however, a guy by the name of Admiral Davidson, who was the commander of Indo-Pacific Command at the time, went and testified before Congress, and he says, this is only 4 years after, right? They started in 2014. In 2018, he goes to talk before Congress, and he says, I can tell you now that for everything other than war with the United States, China controls the South China Sea. Now, what an indictment that is, right? All of a sudden, it just happened? All of a sudden, the commander of Indo-Pacific Command saying, well, look, now we have a problem because they control the entire South China Sea. And it was even worse because in 2015, the president brought this up. Obama brought this up with Xi Jinping and said, my guys, silly guys, these guys have been telling me that you're building these militarized islands in the South China Sea and it's a problem for us. And Xi Jinping looked right in his eye and he said, I will tell you now, we're never going to militarize those islands. Until like 6 months later, you militarize the island.
Yeah.
My point is, intelligence services are important. Intelligence services that are reporting on key threats to the nation are important. And if you don't have them doing that, that's a bad thing. And maybe you get away with having more money for your constituents or whatever, but it's a bad thing for the nation. And now, and it wasn't just for CIA that had this problem. The entire military had this problem. In fact, you mentioned, Milley, former chief of staff for the military, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he himself, when he was the chairman of the Army before he became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he said, we have mortgaged our future to counterterrorism, because at that time he had all of a sudden seen, he all of a sudden figured out that China was a problem. And he looked at the military, the entire military, the Navy and the Army and the Air Force, and he realized all they had been doing is focusing on counterterrorism the whole time. Their tactics, their techniques, everything. Their budgets. The Navy let its ships go. We don't have a Navy anymore. Pretty much, and that all happened because nobody was at watch. In the naval sense, nobody was on watch. If you had the CIA with that side of the house still active for that whole time, you'd be bugging policymakers and writing reports, and reports would be leaked to Congress and things like that. And the policymakers would have to take a notice and have to do things, but they never had to, because you didn't have those people coming up and saying, "Hey, boss, we have a problem," And so that's how it happened.
Oh, I see like an existential, like you mentioned Obama, right? And Fareed Zakaria famously called him the first post-American president. And he
Yeah,
said, he
yeah,
spent
yeah,
childhood in Indonesia and his, went to visit Pakistan in the 80s and all these things. And so he was saying that his worldview was really more of a globalist worldview. And the ethos of Obama was once again that the American people are the enemy. They're the evil KKK. They're bad people, and this world outside are the good people. These Muslims are the good people. And so the CIA gets these directives, and all of our intelligence agencies under Obama, that you can't even link terrorist with Muslim.
yeah.
Suddenly they cut out the legs from under them. And but where I'm going with this is I was reading this book by Admiral Stavridis. It was a
Uh-huh.
book ostensibly on naval history, and Stavridis, who was born in Greece, says that he takes a very unprofessional stab at Donald Trump. And there's many reasons for you to criticize Donald Trump, but it just seemed very odd that all of a sudden he was very professional. And then he veers into this thing where he attacks Trump for the discredited notion of nationalism. And he said, where we really need to do is NATO and globalism, internationalism. And really we have to protect this global, power grid at the expense of these evil, bad, horrible Americans. And suddenly you see this world. So there's two different worldviews. There's the CIA of Brian Fairchild. You
Yeah,
grew up, you were thinking of protecting the homeland, you were thinking of America, Americanism from foreign threats. And now you have this weird worldview where they've gotten rid of the Brian Fairchilds. They've
yeah.
systematically removed all the patriots, replaced them with foreign born globalists like Stavridis. And they see the Americans as the bad guys. And we're really here to do NATO and the global grid.
Right. And they could get away with it because they didn't have that side warning, warning anybody or forcing it down their throats. And yeah, you've got absolutely great points, and it's sad, but even now it's still sad because we're getting back into the game, right? When I say we, I mean CIA. CIA is getting back into the game because it's for so long we've been hit right between the eyes, and sooner or later they had to take notice. Well, we're in a new Cold War. You don't hear people talk about that. We're in a new Cold War, but we've not been in a new Cold War for the last 6 months or 18 months. I wrote a paper on this 7 years ago. Before Trump came to power, I wrote a paper and I said, it was basically to whomever will become the leader, of the United States. Here's some things you ought to know. CIA is no longer, the nation's premier intelligence service. It's become a paramilitary service, and you need that other kind of service, and so forth and so on. But the title of the paper was CIA Terrorism and the Emergent New Cold War. Now, I wrote that 7 years ago, and we were already into a Cold War, back then. Well, for 2 years, my fellows within the intelligence community and people poo-pooed that whole thing. Come on, Fairchild. What are you, emergent new Cold War? What are you talking about? And I stuck to my guns and I said, that's exactly what's going on, absolutely what's going on. And 2 years later, I wrote it in 2016. In 2018, all of a sudden, CIA had to admit, the head of the Asian Pacific Center that I mentioned, in the Aspen, talk, they meet at Aspen every year and talk about, defense and so forth. And asked the question. He said, "Yeah, we'd have to say that in actual fact, what China is doing is they're waging a kind of Cold War against us, right? Because no war is the same, right? I mean, you had the Civil War, well, Civil War, the Vietnam War, World War I, World War II, they're all called wars, but they're very different than one another, right? And so the people who didn't want to admit that we're in a new Cold War, would say, "Oh well, we're in a Cold War, but it's not the same as the old Cold War, but it's even worse now because we don't have just one adversary; we have a new axis of evil." Right? We've got China and Russia and North Korea and Iran, and they coordinate together as an entity to use our resources and spread our resources to the four winds. And so it's even a worse kind of a Cold War now, but you still don't have people saying we're in a Cold War. In fact, you've got, the president saying we're not even enemies with China, we're just competitors. And that's a real problem. If you don't have the right, right assumption on what's going on in the world, how can you counter anything? You can't. So
Well, I've noticed that too. Well, I mean, just to mention a stealth Cold War that's happening right now. At the beginning of this year, the Biden administration had brought in Japan and the Netherlands to do an embargo on chip making technology to China. And the Netherlands, in particular, they have a company called ASML, which is like 10 years ahead of everybody else in advanced chip
right.
making technology. And so the Chinese basically, when the Americans kind of did this economic warfare against them because they're a manufacturing economy, they need those chips for their machines. They responded by saying, okay, you're not going to give us the chip making technology. We're going to deny you these rare earth elements, 92% of which are in China or Central Asia. And then
Yeah.
so now you see this response of Western nations that are seizing land in their own countries because they've got to source lithium domestically now, or they've got to source,
Right.
nickel or whatever. And they're going and taking over farmland. They're dispatching geologists, seeing if there's like, like rare earth elements or, chip making elements
Yeah.
underneath these
Yeah.
farms and seizing them under eminent domain.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, there another way of looking at what I've described, here talking with you just today, is yeah, you can look at it from how I describe CIA and the two houses, sides of the house, and all that sort of thing. But maybe the key way to refer to the U.S. government as an entity is for all that time, for over 20 years, we had no strategic understanding of the world. Now, for your listeners, let me define what I mean by strategic. In tactical, which is counterterrorism, you know, that one guy over there, we think that he's going to blow up something, one of our embassies. We're going to go after that guy, and here's how we're going to do it. We're going to do it with a team, and they're going to come in on a helo, and they're going to get over here, and they're going to go through the city, and they're going to come to him, boom, and they're going to get him, and then they're going to go home, and it's a successful mission. That's tactics. Strategy is what the hell's going on in the world? Who are our enemies in the world? What are our national interests in the world? Do we have any ways of protecting those national interests? And if not, we ought to build those up. What is the strategic situation in the world? And nobody for the last 20 years has looked at anything going on in the world strategically. And now we got Biden, and he's not. I mean, he goes out of his way to appease China and to say China's just a competitor when China's running over us every single day.
Mhm.
So there's no strategic outlook, and there's no. If you think back, I mean, other than voices like Representative Gallagher, who's the chairman of the Select Committee on Competition with China and the Chinese Communist Party. He's pushing stuff down people's throats, and he's being very active doing that. And then other politicians join with him and go, yeah, yeah, let's get in on what Mike's doing here, But there's still no, and you had Burns, you had the new director of CIA, do his hearings and say, oh, ask about it. One of the key questions that everybody asked him about was China. He said, "Oh yeah, China's changed the whole game. We're really going to do stuff about China now," and it still hasn't happened. And I mean, there's no strategic center of the government that's looking out for our strategic needs, and it's just a knee jerk reaction to everything that's going on. Because if you
Mhm.
talk to people in the military, you can couch it as strategic. You say, well, look at what we're doing, man. We got forces in the Middle East. We got, carrier battle groups up by North Korea. I mean, we're being strategic all over the place, but you're not. You're reacting to things, but you're not being strategic. Because if you're being strategic, you'd say, how many forces do we have? Out of all these threats we face, where do we need to place our forces for how long? And what happens if something else happens while we're putting those forces there? Like you've got these things going on in the Middle East. Great. You got these things going up by North Korea. You're helping Ukraine. What happens if China walks on Taiwan right now? What's your strategy? What are you going to do? What resources are you going to put against that? And from where are you going to take those resources? And from what budget are you going to take those resources? That's what I mean by strategy. You've got to have people thinking it through, seeing the 4 or 5 moves down the road, playing chess when instead of playing checkers. And we're not doing that. And I don't hear any voices coming up from CIA. I don't hear Burns going to Congress and saying, guys, we're doing this the wrong way. We got these real threats and they're all together against us. But we're looking at them as though they're separate and like we can handle them separately, but they're all against us and doing things against us every day. And we're not reacting properly. So that's the place I am. It's like,
Yeah,
man,
in ethics, they have, means and ends, right? So you have the end, the goal that you're supposed to do, and then you have means to get to that goal. So
right.
as I'm listening to you, strategy is like the end. What is our overall purpose? And so
Sure.
they've gotten rid of their purpose, their tellus, right? It goes away. There's no strategy, and they're reactive, and it's just means with
Yeah.
no end. And
And,
so it's kind of like the body, just to use that metaphor. There's muscle and there's intelligence, right? So
yeah.
they shifted to this muscle kind of, oh, just send in SEAL
Right.
Team 6 or whatever, and they've forgotten so there's no intelligence in the intelligence.
Right. Right.
Just
There's
because
no
muscle.
intelligence in the perfect, perfect analogy. But so that's bad enough, right? That's bad enough. I mean, we've just talked. We almost solved all the world's problems here, but we have a bad situation, and it's only getting worse, right? Because China is really taking over the world, and and so now we need the spy agency more than anything, right? We need to have that other side of the house. We need to know what Xi Jinping is thinking. Is he really going to go after Taiwan? What's all this deal about moving his military and all these assets, building the Air Force bases, modernizing the Air Force bases along, the coast with Taiwan? We need to know what's the answer to that. So what you got to do is you got to put spies, out into the world, and they have to understand the world, and they have to understand the countries that we're targeting on. And so you can't just grab a guy, and you certainly can't grab a paramilitary officer who's a certain kind of guy. If you think of every special operator you've ever known, I have nothing but the highest respect for all special operators. SEAL Team 6, Delta, I've known these guys. They're great guys. I'd like to be them someday, but they're not that kind of a spy. They're a paramilitary guy. They're military. They think in a military sense. An effective spy could be a deaf person, watching a certain location and jotting down the truck numbers and stuff that are going to that location. You don't have to have a paramilitary operator to do that. In fact, the deaf guy works better because everybody looks at him and thinks he's nothing.
He's
He can't
invisible.
be important to me, right? So
Yeah.
you need that kind of a mindset. But what CIA did the whole Cold War is they go out and they say, well, all you 20 somethings, 25-year-old something, if you're interested in being a spy like James Bond, send in your applications and we'll look through them and decide who we want. And then they'll choose guys like Brian Fairchild or whatever, and then they'll put them on a cookie cutter, uh, uh, conveyor belt, and they'll start training them. Because when you're 20 something, you don't know anything, right? You just come out of your mom's basement. You don't know what really is a CIA, what the CIA do, what's CIA's mission, how are CIA offices, congregated, how do you write for the CIA? You've got to learn all that, right? It's just like going into a Fortune 500 company. You start at the bottom and you've got to learn. If somebody says you got to go to the seventh floor, what does that mean? Well, you're going to go see the director. Well, who exactly is the director? I mean, all
Yeah.
this kind of stuff, right? So they put you through the paces like this, and then you do interim assignments to different offices, and then at some point they say, okay, well, and they're watching you the whole time. And at some point they go, well, okay, let's send this guy down to the farm. So then they send you down to the farm, and you're going to be down there for as long as it takes. If you have no military experience, they'll give you some military experience now. If you don't understand how to run clandestine operations, that's why you're there. They're going to tell you how to do that. So then you do that, and then they put you overseas because that's what it's all about, right? I mean, you got to have these sensors overseas collecting intelligence. So how you put those sensors overseas is crucial. It's not just, yeah, it's kind of important. It's crucial. And let me explain why. In espionage, there are two rules. There are two things you have to figure out. You're trying to penetrate a country and understand what its secrets are, and the counterintelligence services of that country are trying to stop you, right? Pretty easy to understand. Spies and spy catchers, spy versus spy, right? So what's important in that equation? Well, if you're the spy, if you go and tell people you're a spy, that's not a good thing, right? I think we can all agree that's not a good thing. If you have
Yeah.
lousy cover and everybody knows you're a spy, but you don't say you're a spy, that's just as bad, right? So what CIA's cover has always been, is let's put Brian Fairchild in an embassy in an overseas position, give him diplomatic immunity, a black passport, and have him run around and find out the stuff that we need and penetrate the government. But if all the counterintelligence services know I'm a spy undercover, is it hard for them to watch me? No, they go, let's focus on Brian and these guys and these guys. And then, so people in your audience might go, yeah, but cover doesn't work that way. Cover is really real. It's not. For 20 years I served undercover, and I served, as unofficial cover, which is the best kind of cover, as well as official cover. And I can tell you that the local services, local counterintelligence services in every station that I was working in knew how many guys we had in the station. They would write public articles and say, Tokyo Station got like 31 clandestine service officers. Maybe had we 32. They missed one. We're doing a good job.
Yeah.
I mean, so you can't do that. You can't use that kind of cover anymore. Now, to be clear and to be, to give the devil is due, during most of the Cold War, we didn't have to worry about that too much because we owned the counterintelligence services, right? It was the Soviet Union rising up and taking over the world. And the United States went out and, we went to these little states and nations and said, hey, we'd like to operate here and we'd like to train your guys to operate against those bad Soviets. So oftentimes, those counterintelligence services were working at our behest against the Soviets. But at some point, during the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, a lot of those governments started changing and becoming critical of CIA, critical of the United States policy, right? So all of a sudden you can't count on those counterintelligence services anymore. Now you really have to have good cover, but they all know who you are. And we keep replacing me with another guy, and that guy with another guy, and that guy with another guy. And then, so it became more and more, untenuous. You couldn't do it anymore. Now it's impossible to do it because now you've got this amazing, amazing surveillance technology that if you let anybody know your starting point, you're toast. And what is an embassy, Daniel? I mean, an embassy, we literally get a flag, a United States flag, and we stick it in the sand and we say, this is home, away from home. This is the United States government
territory. Yeah.
And all of our spies are right here. There you go. And we're not going to tell you about a couple that we have over in Fortune 500 companies, or a couple that we got unofficial over here. We're not going to tell you about that, but then when you use the internal officers to meet with the non-official cover officers, and that guy's being followed, well, that doesn't work very well either, right? You let him right to the non-official cover guy that is never supposed to be revealed, but that's what happens, So, but now you've got, and China excels at all this. I mean, China is the biggest surveillance state in the entire world right now. And they've got this amazing technology, and you heard about all their CCTV cameras, and they basically are trying to wipe out the Uyghur race through genocidal policies. They put up roadblocks in Xinjiang. They take blood samples. They don't allow
credit scores.
The women to get pregnant. I mean, it's terrible. But all of our Fortune 500 companies want to trade with them. I mean, if you saw the love fest when Xi Jinping came to San Francisco, all these corporate guys go, and giving them a standing ovation.
Yep. And Trudeau Trudeau in Canada saying that he wanted to model.
I mean, you get a kind of understanding of the assumptions that we're making about China in this administration, but so China's got this amazing technology. And I mean, I could go on and on about a whole bunch of technology. They've got you covered coming and going. But I just want to tell you about this one technology because it's just so amazing. It's called WAMI, Wide Area Motion Imagery. So funny sounding name, it's like what kind of threat could WAMI be? It's like a wiffle ball sort of thing, the WAMI game. But WAMI is intense. I mean, WAMI is a small package. It used to be a classified program. We used it in the war zones, in Afghanistan and Iraq. But now you can Google WAMI and you'll come up to with the major technology firms that are developing it and selling it not just to the United States but around the world, right? Well, China is like this, even above us in many technologies. So Here's whammy technology. It's a small package. You can put it on a Cessna plane. You can put it on a big drone. You can put it in a satellite. You can put it pretty much anywhere. It's got a big cone of action. I mean, when you're photographing the ground, the cone goes like this over like almost the whole city. And all you've got to do is put that package on a plane or whatever, aerial, vessel you're going to have, and it circles the city and it continually focuses that cone on the city. And since it's covering basically the whole city at one time, it's digital. It records every movement in the city. I mean, I can't say this too many times. Every movement. So if I come out to get my daily paper, and it's going over my city, I'm recorded. And if I get in my car and I go to McDonald's, like I do in the mornings to get an Egg McMuffin, I'm recorded. And not only that, but I'm recorded for as long as they keep those files, right? 20 years, if it goes that long, something else will replace it. But I mean, the last 5 years or whatever, if all of a sudden I become a target, they can go back and they can say, what's little Brian Fairchild doing? Where has he gone? And they'll know
Wow.
every place, every person, every business that I've been to. Now that's just that one thing. Now you add, cell phone coverage onto that, and you add CCTV cameras onto that, and you add the TV, the cameras and the shops and so forth and so on, and it's all put together. And then just tracking technology. I mean, now you've got this is the era of these little button things that you can get, to see if your luggage is going to get lost in the airport, but lovers are using it against their lovers to see if they're cheating. And I mean, there's so much technology out there. If anybody knows where you are and where you're starting, you don't have a prayer. Yet, CIA is still putting people in official cover. And so, and CIA has, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the CIA has had major operational problems in the last few years. I mean, first of all, back in 2010, the Chinese wrapped up the entire CIA network that was operating in China back in 2010. A couple dozen people got killed. They captured them and shot them. They shot one guy in the courtyard in front of his colleagues to sort of send the message: you don't want to be, working for the Americans. This is what's going to happen to you. But wiped out the entire, network. And so CIA started trying to figure out, how could that be? Do we have a mole? Was it technology? I mean, what was it? Now, just a year and a half ago, CIA counterintelligence came out and said, and this is publicly available, so please Google it and check me out and do the fact check. This isn't bull. I mean, this is what's actually happening. So about a year and a half ago, CIA sent a cable out to its worldwide stations and bases that goes to everybody, saying, man, lately we've had a bad string of luck. We have dozens of our sources, the people that you, Brian Fairchild, are recruiting and running as spies in that country. And these sources are being wrapped up and killed and imprisoned. And, what are you guys doing? We think that you're not doing enough counterintelligence. We don't think your tradecraft is good enough. You're allowing people to follow you, stuff like that. Well, the reason is what I'm talking about. If you put somebody, you put the flag in, put somebody next to the flag, and you say, okay, Brian, now remember, you're going to do a surveillance detection route, but do a really long one because we got to make sure you're not being followed. Okay, well, I could be running around town all day. If I've got whammy above me, it doesn't matter. They've got me. When I go down the block, they've got, CCTV and they're, videoing me. They've got, guys in cars that have, license plate readers, around the city reading my license plate. I mean, there's no way you can do it. There's just no way. And it's not just me that says this now, because just about a year ago or so, a guy by the name of Michael Morrell, who's got a podcast called Intelligence Matters and was at one time the acting chief of CIA, and Don Myrick, who was Q for the, Q in the James Bond movies, the guy that does all the cool equipment and stuff. Well, Don Myrick was the analog of Q for the CIA. And they did a podcast, and both of them agreed that, the technological advancements, are existential for American spies in those positions. Existential, wipes you out. It's like a dinosaur. Boom, you're gone. It's existential. You can't operate like that anymore. And yet we still do. And they try to make workarounds. They say, well, Don Myrick said, we did this program where we first of all we figure that 30 countries, those counterintelligence services in 30 countries can follow our guys without ever having a person, just technologically they can follow our guys all around. That's a problem for us, you know. And then yeah, but she said, okay, so and then we got digital dust, right? So
Yeah.
if you say you're working for this company based down in Dallas, Texas, but when the Chinese soak up all the information that they do every single day and they apply it against you, all your digital dust, meaning where you bought a hot dog, where you got gasoline, where you lived, where you bought gasoline, who you paid your mortgage to, where your
Mhm.
bank account is, it's all around Northern Virginia and CIA headquarters. Hmm, how does that work? So with the digital dust,
Mhm.
all this the technology, you just can't operate that anymore.
I just
There,
was reading a book called Code Halos, and it was about that, about data exhaust and how you
oh
can
yeah,
use, like when you create a quote unquote code halo around someone, so you know what they bought on Amazon.com, you know what library book they checked out, you know what food they like in the supermarket, and it
yeah.
creates a profile around the person. And they said that they had captured, China had used these technologies to
Oh yeah,
capture several CIA agents in China
yeah.
and in India, I
Absolutely, and
believe.
that's what I'm
Yeah.
saying. All these, these cases that have gone south and people have been arrested and shot and so forth and so on. The major reason is most likely what I'm talking about here. It's not about some mole or something. We have lousy trade craft, and if you put somebody out in an embassy and he runs around for an hour or so and goes to a secret meeting, they got you. And so Don Myrick was saying, well, this is a concern for us. So we've done a study recently and we looked at one city, and she wouldn't talk about what the city was, but we did a study in one city of all their electronic capabilities to monitor us, and we found a section of the city where that's not happening. So imagine if you're a case officer, well, you could just go to the section of that section of the city, and do your stuff and get away with it, you know. Now, first of all, it doesn't matter, because you've just told the world that that happens. So any counterintelligence service is sitting there goes, hey, don't we have a blind spot over in that park? Fix it. So that's a problem right there. And then she says, and then we can do workarounds like, we can spoof your phone. So like if you go out with your family to a movie and you're supposed to be at the movie, well, the phone will say that you're at the movie, but you're really over there doing secret stuff. Well, that's all great. And that might be wonderful technology if you didn't have all the cameras everywhere. And so the guy sitting behind the screen goes, hey, boss, we got a problem here. I'm watching Fairchild right now. We got Whammy up. I'm watching Fairchild right now. He came out of the movie a half an hour ago and stuff, but his phone says he's still in the movie theater. You're not fooling anybody, right? So
Yeah.
you can try workarounds all you want, and this technology is only going to get better, right? It's not going to get worse. So how do you counter this? Well, there is. Can I continue? I've just
Yeah,
been
absolutely.
chattering on here. You want me to continue or?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
All right. So okay. So I wrote this book, right? And the reason I'm bringing up the book
The
now is
hidden.
because, yeah, the hidden. And the reason I wrote the hidden, which refers to remaining hidden below China's radar. That's the whole purpose of the title. And I wrote the book because I was pissed off. I didn't write it because, I'm a Jack London or, a great writer or anything. I wrote it because I got pissed off at CIA for doing this stuff that we're talking about. And so I've been, writing to CIA and saying, you can't do this. You can't do this. There are ways you can do this, but you can't do it this way. And of course, nobody's going to say anything about me or, come to me and say, well, thanks, Brian, for solving our problem. So I got pissed off and I wrote the book. And what the book's basic approach is that everything that we just talked about, CIA is broken. It can't operate the way it's been operating, so, it's got to find a new way. But it's got to be completely divorced from CIA because if you just talk about what we talked about,
Mhm.
what's the likelihood that you can have cover at CIA headquarters, going into headquarters and out of headquarters every day when you're being surveilled and they've got every license plate that's ever gone in or out, right? And even if they didn't have that kind of technology, Daniel, if you had 15 guys during rush hour, going down Route 123, in Northern Virginia, this way, and 15 guys going this way, just writing the license plate numbers for everybody that's turning into the CIA turn lanes. You've got them just that like that in the simplest technology of all, right? No great whammy or anything. But in 1975, the United States government said that our own technology, our own satellite technology, was good enough that we had the ability to take a picture of a license plate. Well, if we could do that in 1975, do you think the Chinese might be able to do that today?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
so you can't do it out of CIA anymore. CIA has really kind of become obsolete. I say keep CIA, keep the paramilitary aspect, keep all your science and technology development, keep all your intelligence analysis there, give you a reason to use up that space and all those satellite buildings all over Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. Great. Don't just disband and throw everybody to the four winds. Keep that stuff there because you're not overseas operators. But for the clandestine service, now you have to do it absolutely radically different, completely different, and it can't have anything to do with you. You know. So here's my concept that you've got to do it like right now the way we scout talent, as we say, send in your application. When I was first coming on board, there were a few professors and things that were, former intelligence officers or who had relationships with the agency or the military or whatever, who might spot you and say, hey, if you guys are looking for someone, you might check out this Fairchild guy, and they would get leads that way. But mostly it was, send in your application. And so then you go through the whole thing. Everybody's got to go to CIA. Everybody got interviewed, the whole thing. They're recording you, you're not undercover anymore and doesn't matter. Or you can do it like sports talent scouts. So sports talent scouts don't have a headquarters. They don't call you to their headquarters. They don't interview you in your headquarters. They got a guy like me or you, and they say, hey, you know more about ball than I'll ever know. Go out to these junior high school games, junior college games, and find talent for us. I'm the NFL. I'm this team. I want to find talent. I need a wide receiver. I need a quarterback. I need a guard. Whatever I need, you go out and find those guys for me. And the sports, talent scout, he goes out and he sits at these games and he's watching these guys. And he's nothing here, nothing here. Goes to the next game and he goes, well, that guy's kind of interesting. I'll make a note and I'll watch him in the coming year. That sort of thing. And at a certain time, he finds talent and he goes, holy crap. Look at the arm on that guy. Whoa, can that guy hit? Look at that. Man, look at that home run. And he's jotting all this down. Maybe he even goes down to the bench and hey, I just wanted to thank you for that wonderful exhibition of hitting. How do you do that? And he gets to know the guy a little bit, but he doesn't say I'm a sports talent scout. He's just doing this for his job. Then he goes back to the NFL with the other sports talent scouts, and they sit around a boardroom, and they say, oh, I got Timmy, I got Chad, I got Brian, I got Bill, and they're doing all this, and they say, well, let's look at the film that you've got. And, oh, I really like that guy, but I kind of like this guy more. And they choose somebody, and then they go to that guy and they say, how would you like to be a star? Right. And that's how the guy starts his professional career. If you did the same thing with Americans, but forget about the 20 somethings, forget about training people like you're a Fortune 500 company. Go out and find the guys who already have the talent, who already
Interesting.
exist. Go out to the businessmen in Zambia, in Burundi, in Indonesia, in Thailand. You go to the guys, in the business community that have established business. Maybe they're even married to locals. They've been there for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years doing business. They've got existing networks, but the guy was in the military. He's every indication that he's loyal to the United States and he'd like to still help and make a contribution to his country. And if you can find those guys, and then you wait until they're on a trip coming back to the United States and you have somebody run into them and say, will you help your country? Here, I've got a proposition for you. That's the way to do it
Well,
because they've
that's
already been
interesting.
looked at. They've been
That
looked at by the counterintelligence services 15 times. And they say, yeah, this guy's nothing. He's been here doing business. He does business with my cousin. I mean, we've checked him out. He's not a threat. Let's go and look at the embassy where the threat is. Let's go look at the Fortune 500 companies where a few guys are probably squirreled away somewhere. That's the threat. Not this guy who's been selling Montana beef for the last 10 years. He's not a threat. And that's how you can do it. But to do that, CIA has to admit they're obsolete. They're not going to have anything to do with it. It's got to be a whole new organization, maybe headquarters out of Poughkeepsie, New York. They have nothing to do with the Beltway and Washington, D.C. And you could probably do it and do it well.
Well, one of I'm gonna the theme of this interview has been going full circle. Like you start with Jack London, you go into the CIA, you come back and you write the hidden. Or in this case, when the CIA first started in the OSS, it did very much like what you just described, right? So they didn't have like an apparatus yet, and so they go to a guy named Cornelius Vanderstar, right? And he's the guy who founded AIG. He's in Shanghai, and they had all this actuarial information about, during World War II, what bridges can we bomb? How many potholes are in the street? And they used those pre-existing people who had expertise. So basically, what you're talking about is they've lost their way, and you're trying to get them back to a model that where they started at. So anyway, let's go ahead. Okay, finish. This is the last thing, and then we'll wrap it up here. Go.
Okay. Okay. I'm just going to say that the institution. See, whenever you have an elite organization like the OSS or the SEAL teams or SEAL Team 6 or Delta, over time they become less and less elite, right? They become institutions, and then institutions get more conveyor belt systems in and so forth and so on. You're no longer elite sort of thing. Like, when CIA first started, I mean, it was an Ivy League thing, and you had the professors and, all the guys who were watching and picking out the best and the brightest and saying, hey, Bill, you might want to check out these guys. Then maybe they'd make an approach to you. But then it got to be too big. And then they, somebody got the idea, well, let's just do this like as a macro program and just run people through this conveyor belt and get them overseas because the Soviets were taking over the world. We just need to throw guys out there and see if it, like throwing spaghetti against the wall and see if it sticks. We don't care if they have the skills, just put them out there and have them try. And if they try, some of them are going to succeed. And that's how it, so no longer are they looking for the elite. What we need to be doing now is finding clandestine service officers akin to the guys going into SEAL Team 6 or Delta, the best of the best, the highest of the highest, the guys that have it already. You don't need to teach them. All you need to do is ask them if they'll help. And then you've got a ready-made source, and a lot of these guys have contacts with the government because the governments are corrupt and they got to make payoffs and things. So I mean, it's that kind of thing. That's what we need to do, and hopefully we'll get back to it. So
an appeal
that's why I wrote The Hidden, and it's just it was a anger at the CIA. So if any
you want quality over quantity is what you're saying. We want quality.
Viewers, want to look at The Hidden to see. I mean, they can go to freehiddenchapters.com and they can read the first 3 chapters for free to see, what we talked about, here for a large part.
Yeah. Well, I was going to end with that to tell people exactly. I was going to direct them to Brian Fairchild books.com as well. Sure. Then you can get the chapters there, and very, very good reading. Zambia, China, espionage, just a wonderful, wonderful thing. So is there any other outlet that people can, are you on Twitter? Are you on any other?
Oh yeah. I mean, you can get it from Amazon. You can get it from, Barnes and Noble. You can get it on book reads, all good reads and all that sort of thing. I mean, it's out there. For the most part, you probably have to order it. It won't be, in on the bookshelves and stuff. I'm not that big a guy yet.
Well, you will be soon. Well, thank you for coming on, Brian Fairchild, and
my pleasure. Thank you very much.
I'd like to take a moment to thank you for watching. If you'd like to stay updated, hit the like and subscribe buttons. But more importantly, if you don't want to see me reduced to shelling my old merch, such as the Daniel Natal in action figure, where you can see Daniel engaging in an action as he watches TV, or engaging in an action as he surfs the internet, or failed products like the Daniel Natal Pez dispenser, or the even more ill-considered Daniel Natal urinal cake. Think about supporting the show by buying one of my books. For instance, you can buy my book, Actionable Ethics. The link is in the description below.